We move on to the next chapter, which is the rise of the nationhood. It is a period just immediately after the war to about the 1950s. This is the period where the pioneer artists thrive. After the war, artistic activity soon revived, and NAFA reopened in 1946. And by 1949, it is reported that there were 17 art exhibitions, and amongst them solo shows by artists and group exhibitions by various art societies. And during this period, the British power started to diminish, and there's a need for new identity. Around this time, Liu Kang, Chen Wen Hsi, and Cheong Soo Pieng came to Singapore. So the art scene is now in its full swing. It climaxed with the formation of the Singapore Art Society in 1949, which propelled Singapore art scene to the next level. The Singapore Art Society was an important milestone in Singapore art history because it was the first time to advocate a multicultural society. Remember, the previous art societies were formed by ethnic Chinese. But this Singapore Art Society, it was formed by various societies and institutions. Example, the British Council, Society of Malay Artists, Society of Chinese Artists, Indian Fine Arts Society, YMCA, Art Club, and NAFA. Amongst these, the British Council and the YMCA Art Club represents the colonial powers. But we also see here Society of Malay Artists, Indian Fine Arts Society, which means that actually after the war, there should be some form of art activities by Malays and Indians. But it is just that we did not have enough research on them, and therefore we do not know much about them, but it doesn't mean that they didn't exist. The Singapore Art Society is still fairly active today. In the 1950s, the Singapore Art Societies organized art shows almost every year, and each of the show can reach about 100 over pieces. Thus, we can imagine this show to be like the salon of Singapore art. From some of the exhibition catalogues, we know that the exhibitions were held at the Victoria Memorial Hall. And during the 1950s, we see the emergence of many important second-gen artists. For example, the Equator Art Society was formed in the early 1950s. We will talk more about the Equator Art Society later. So let's talk a little bit about this Nanyang era where the issue of identity is important. First, we talk about this 1952 legendary Bali trip. What happened was, in 1952, there were 4 artists, Cheong Soo Pieng, Chen Wen Hsi, Chen Chong Swee, and Liu Kang. They were all teachers from Chinese High, and they seek the approval of the principal to give them long leave, around 1 or 2 months, to travel from Singapore to Bali. They didn't travel to Bali direct. What they did was, they left Singapore and went down Sumatra, Java, all along their route, and final destination was Bali. This trip gave them many inspirations to paint Southeast Asian themes, and it gave them some inspirations to shift their artistic personality or identity to fit into this newfound homeland, this Southeast Asia. So after they returned from the trip in 1953, there was an art exhibition held in Singapore to show the artworks produced during the trip, and it was reported that that show was a blockbuster, and it was a very big event during that time. This is a photo of the 1952 Bali trip. This picture was taken in Ubud in the terrace rice fields. And if you go to Bali today, you will see this exact same place in the exact same setting. I think not much has changed since that time. In the center row on the left is Chen Wen Hsi, followed by Liu Kang, and then Cheong Soo Pieng was next. And the next guy, we don't know who he is, and the one on the far right is Chan Shou She. We shall now talk a little bit about what is Nanyang style actually. This term was not in the artist's mind when they went to Bali in the 1950s. For them, they just go for a painting trip. The term was coined in 1970s by a team of art historians, one of which was P.K. Sababati. The definition of Nanyang style is actually very loose. It could be anything that, so long as the subject matter is those reflecting the Southeast Asian themes, Or maybe the styles that's following the big four artists, we call them Nanyang style. Or some even say that you have to be a NAFA graduate to be Nanyang style. So there is all kinds of definition. And the Nanyang style was important not only because it brings about an identity, but it also influenced a whole generation of artists. This is a work by Cheong Soo Pieng around 1954 or 55. This is what I feel is the Nanyang style. You can see from this painting, first it has a cubist treatment. Cubist treatment means the artist try to simplify the forms of the subjects into various geometric shapes like circle, triangle, or rectangular. And then you find that there is this delineated black outlines. And also there is a use of primary colors. When we talk about primary colors here, we don't really talk about the scientific red, green, blue primary colors, but rather it is sort of like pure colors. Pure orange, pure yellow, pure black, pure red, and so on and so forth. Now, this style was popular in the 50s and 60s, and many of the second-gen artists painted in this style sometime in their career. This is another rendition of Nanyang style. It is by Ye Zhiwei, who is another pioneer artist. You see the cubist treatment, the primary colors, but it doesn't really have the black outline. Instead, it has the black outline is replaced by white outlines. So the Nanyang style was supposed to be the first locally developed art style in Singapore, and it provided the sense of identity to this newfound nation. In a way, I felt that the term Nanyang style was a little bit politically driven, because as a newfound nation, we need to have a cultural identity. And that is why only in the 1970s, we sort of come up with this term. The Nanyang era only lasted about 2 decades. In the 1950s, the first generation practiced it quite a lot. And in the 60s, the second generation sort of followed in their teachers' footsteps. But by the time we reached the 70s, almost all the artists, including first and second gen, they have moved on to other styles. Next, we'll look at a few pioneer artists in more details. The first artist we'll talk about is Cheong Soo Pieng. Cheong Soo Pieng may have been the greatest artist ever lived in Singapore. Personally, I feel that his only rival is Lee Man Fong. This is because Lee was very highly regarded in Indonesia. Because of that, Lee is not usually attributed as a Singapore artist. Most of the time, we say that he's an Indonesian artist. Of course, there are some people who say that Chen Wen Hsi is better than Cheong Soo Pieng. I think this is a matter of personal preference. Of course, Chen Wen Hsi is also a very good artist. The significance of Cheong Soo Pieng was not just the artistic height that he has achieved, but we also have to bear in mind the width of his practice. He really has a very wide range of painting styles that is very difficult to find in artists all over the world. As an art teacher, Cheong Soo Pieng influenced an entire generation of artists. People like Tay Bak Koi, Pan Zheng Lei, and Jehan Chan were few examples of the second generation artists who at one point of time in their career, they painted very much like Cheong Soo Pieng styles. Cheong Soo Pieng has too many styles to introduce in today's course. We have a dedicated course for him, and you can approach us to sign up for the course. So this is an early Soo Pieng ink, probably painted during his Bali trip. One of the first things we recognize is his signature. During this period, he is still signing in the traditional Chinese scripts. Soo Pieng is essentially trained in Western art. So even his Chinese painting, early in his career, it is more like painting in the Western style, but using Chinese medium. Which is why you see here in this 1960 example, it is painted using the Chinese medium, but you feel that it is a Western painting. So one important topic within the Nanyang style discourse was the acceptance of Western ideas, and Soo Pieng applied it to his ink mediums. So Cubism was very much used by many Nanyang artists. This is one of Cheong Soo Pieng's gifts to us, creating an artistic language using Cubist ideas and applying it on Chinese ink medium. This piece you see here is also another ink work around 1960. This is a very important ink work. Around this time, the artists in mainland China, they were so engrossed with the political movements in China that they are fighting for their own survival. and they had no time for artistic innovations. And people like Chao Ki and Zhu Dechun, having migrated to Paris, working very hard to come up with a new kind of Chinese art. So similarly here, Soo Pieng is also doing it in his own ways. And you can see here, this piece of abstract landscape is very different from traditional landscape paintings. And in this way, Soo Pieng actually put us, Singapore, in the forefront of Chinese ink art developments back then in the 1960s.
In late 1961, Soo Pieng traveled to Europe. Over there, he stayed in UK and went to a few European countries. For example, we know he went to Belgium, Germany, and probably France. He was also able to see European masters' art at first hand, and also probably had opportunities to interact with contemporary European artists of the day. During his stay in Europe, he developed his version of the lyrical abstract style. We know that at that time, this movement was in vogue in Europe. This style laid the foundations of his thin oil technique, and he broke free from his Nanyang period.
This piece you see here is an oil on canvas painting dated around 1966. It is a work after he returned from Europe. After he returned from Europe, he devised this, what we call the thin oil techniques. That means making the oil very fluid, such that it could produce effect much like an ink painting. So you can see here, the resulting effect, you see like misty blur effects, so which is what you can do with an ink medium. So this shows Soo Pieng's talents in interplaying both ways, the Western and Chinese mediums. This is a 1970s abstract style that most Singaporeans are not very familiar with. Abstracts that come from this period, they don't really have a fixed iconography. They pretty looks much different, but yet you can see with one glance that they are from Soo Pieng. One of the common characteristics during this period is a sectorized composition. So you can see in this painting that the canvas is divided into sectors.
This painting depicts a scene of the seaside. You can see the top blue part over there is like a wave. Then there is this sand and pebbles along the beach, and in the land area there are contour lines to represent the undulating landscapes. Then about somewhere at the right there is checkered areas which probably depicted tile walkways. From Soo Pieng's perspective, when he looked at the scene, he don't want to just copy the scene like what the plein air artists do. He probably asked himself, what other ways can he express the scene into? This is what he was trying to do in many of his 1970s abstract works.
Soo Pieng's most familiar genre with Singapore audience should be this type, what we call the late decorative style. This late ornate decorative style of slender, lean women is very much prized by collectors. Next, we move on to Chen Wen Hsi. Chen Wen Hsi was also another important painter and art educator, and he achieved great heights in his career. As an artist, the artist creates his own styles in both the ink and oil medium. Wen Hsi's works are so liked by the public that people start to fake his painting during his lifetime. And in the market right now, there's a lot of fake paintings. As an art educator, just like Cheong Soo Pieng, Wen Hsi produced many students. And I think in this respect, Chen Wen Hsi surpassed Soo Pieng. Some of his notable students include Wong Kin, Goh Beng Kwan, Tan Chaw Ti, just to name a few. But many second-generation artists would have learned from both of them though, as they were all art teachers during that time. This piece of oil is probably made during the Bali trip. It showed Chen Wen Hsi was not only an ink painter, but a very good oil painter as well. In fact, being able to cross two mediums of the East and West remained a trait of most of the Nanyang artists. So in the 50s, Both Soo Pieng and Chen Wen Hsi were painting much alike. So sometimes without looking at the signature, it may be a little bit difficult to differentiate between the two of them.
Most of Chen Wen Hsi's works are ink on paper medium. His ink development generally follows a trajectory from realist to abstract expression. Here is an example of his early gibbons. The early gibbons are modeled after real gibbons and painted in a more realist fashion. For example, the digits in the palm and the foot were depicted individually, whereas in the later works they are stylized and they were all depicted in a more abstract manner. This is a rare work of a lady with calligraphy. Most of Chen Wen Hsi's work are actually depicting small animals like squirrels, prawns, sparrows, gibbons, and so on and so forth. Also, Chen Wen Hsi seldom writes many words on his works. Because of his Western painting training, it was easier for him to break away from traditional Chinese painting framework.
This is a 70s work of Gibbon's work by Chen Wen Hsi. I think there's little doubt that one of the most famous subject matter for Chen Wen Hsi is gibbons. Chen Wen Hsi was said to have kept gibbons in his house, and his house, some people call it like a mini zoo. So he observes the animals very regularly. That's why he could capture the form so well. The other important habit of the artist is that he don't really date his works. So it became a problem for us. We could not date the work accurately. Here we see a finger painting that is around the 1980s. Towards the end of his life, Chen Wen Hsi's strokes became bolder and the subject he painted became more abstract. He began to concentrate on big monumental pieces. The cranes was one of his favorite subjects during this period. This piece of crane painting is also a finger painting. Finger painting is a subset of the Chinese ink painting tradition, and he was trained under a very famous Chinese painter by the name of Chan Tien. Amongst all his ink works, finger painting contribute to about 10 or 20% of the output.
By the 80s, Chen Wen Hsi moved to a more abstract phase, using his experiences in Western painting and applying it to Chinese ink painting. For example, in this piece, the white spaces are actually also chicken bodies. Also notice the cubist treatment in this painting. This empty space that represented solid objects were composition concepts proposed by the famous Ming Dynasty Chinese painter Bada Shanren, whom Chen Wen Hsi idolized him. This group of abstract works put him at the forefront of Chinese art at the time.
Next, we have Georgette Chen. Georgette Chen is one of the few female artists we have in Singapore among the first and second generation. Georgette came from a very illustrious Chinese family. She grew up in the West. She spent her youth in Paris and New York. So in a way, she was the cosmopolitan woman of her day. Her father was actually Dr. Sun Yat-sen's patron in terms of finance. So basically, she came from one of the wealthiest family in China. So in a way, we could see her as a semi-aristocrat.
She married Eugene Chen, who was the foreign minister of China.
And after the war, Eugene Chen passed away and she came to Penang in 1951. And later in 1953, she came to Singapore. And after she came to Singapore, she spent most of her time painting and also teaching in NAFA. At one point, Lim Hak Tai actually invited her to take over the post as principal, but she declined because she said that she wanted to devote time for her painting.
Here you see the cover of a 1931 issue of the Chinese magazine Liang Yu. Liang Yu magazine was a pictorial magazine published in Shanghai, something equivalent to the US Life magazine. It showed that he was quite famous in Shanghai at that time. She was one of the famous ladies in the social circle in Shanghai.
Georgette was strongly influenced by the French modern art movement. in particular Van Gogh and Gauguin.
Because Georgette had that aristocrat background, so selling art to get cash was not at the top of her mind. We know she was quite well off because in the 50s, she was already driving a car around, going out to paint. And also, she stayed in the bungalow house in Siglap area. She didn't sell many art in her lifetime, and she painted slowly. She kept most of her work to herself. We have heard of stories like people offering to buy her works, but she declined, citing that she wants to observe her work a little bit more. She also don't have kids, and in the last 10 years of her life, she was bedridden and taken care of by the Lee Foundation. After she passed on, most of her works left with her were donated to the National Collection. And thus her works are extremely rare in the market, almost to the point of impossible to get. You almost can only get her works in the evening sale of Sotheby's or Christie's, Hong Kong.
Next, we have Liu Kang.
Liu Kang was a special case amongst the first generation artists because although he was born in China like the rest, he was considered a Huaqiao, or what we call overseas Chinese, because his parents were staying in Muar and had a business there. He grew up and received his early education both in China and Malaya, eventually ending up in Paris learning art. In the 1930s, he was in Paris together with some other artists like Georgette Chen and her husband Eugene Chen, also with another pioneer artist Chen Zhenhao. Liu Kang eventually married Chen Zhenhao's sister.
And after that, he went back to Shanghai to teach in the art academy. And when the Japanese came, he fled from China back to Malaya, trying to escape the Japanese. But unfortunately, the Japanese caught up with him. He paints in pastels and oil in the French modernist styles. This is a very famous painting depicting Chen Wen Hsi painting a Balinese woman. In a way, this is also a Nanyang style. It has the cubist treatment, the primary colors, it's just that the black outlines is replaced by white outlines. This is another more realist style painting, also most probably painted soon after the Bali trip. This is a later work of Liu Kang. Next, we have Fan Changqian. Fan Changqian is a pioneer artist who had retained the mainland Chinese art traditions. And I think amongst those who were practicing the traditional Chinese art, he achieved the greatest height among all of them. Fan Changqian was an accomplished artist in the Shanghai school, and one of his greatest contributions is being an art educator. He produced many students, and they formed the Huahan Art Society in the 70s. And amongst his students, the most famous were Chua Ek and Nai Sui Ling. So this is a typical Fan Changqian painting in the traditional Shanghai school.
The only local twist was to change the bird into the Miana bird, or in the Chinese we call them Parker, which is a common bird in Singapore.
Fan Changqian was most famous in bamboos and orchids. Personally, I feel that his bamboo paintings were amongst the best in all of Chinese art history. One relatively neglected area of the early Singapore art scene was the group of Chinese calligraphers. In the early days, there were many accomplished Chinese calligraphers. However, like many great calligraphers in history, many of them did calligraphy as a hobby. Many of them were known more for their professional career jobs rather than as a calligrapher. And another reason for the lack of attention given to Chinese calligraphy is perhaps because the current Singapore has become very westernized. so it is difficult for the current population to understand Chinese calligraphy. Among the first generation calligraphers, we'll introduce to you Pan Shou. Pan Shou lived long enough to come to a time when the government started to put attention on the arts and gave him the recognition. He is hailed as our national treasure when he was still alive. During his lifetime, he worked as an administrator. He was once the principal of Taonan School. And people, or he himself, says that he is more of a poet rather than calligraphy. And for his calligraphy, he principally has only one style. So we see here his characteristic calligraphy style.
Another important calligrapher is Chan Shou She, or in Chinese we call him Chang Shou She. He died much earlier, so very few people knew about him. In my opinion, he is the greatest calligrapher in Singapore of all times. He was born and trained in Shanghai and had came into contact with top Chinese artists like Wu Changshuo through his granduncle. He had a career as a teacher, and he was once the dean of the Chinese department of Nanyang University. Interestingly, he had written a textbook about economics. His calligraphy is characterized by very powerful, strong strokes and comparable to many top Chinese calligraphers. This is an example of his work in the cursive script. This is his work in clerical script. This is his work in seal carving script. This is his work in the proper script, or what we call the Wei Bei.
At this point, I would like to call you for some thinking. What do you think is the artistic standard of these pioneer artists? Personally, when I was younger, I felt that many of the pioneer artists were not that good as compared to the Chinese or Western artists. But now, being a more mature person, I realized that first generation artists have their limitations because they did not inherit a rich tradition. And it is also very difficult for them to practice. And therefore, some of them may not be as good as we would like them to be. Having said that, they are still part of our history. And that's why it is still meaningful to collect them. Here are some revision questions to help you with your memory.